Thank you everyone for being here as usual. This is our Thursday night RootsAction No Honeymoon Call series. Appreciate you all being here. We have an excellent guest today, Andrei Tsygankov. I had to spell out how to pronounce the name. I'm doing my best. Tsygankov, who we will get to here in just a little bit. But first, as always, I like to explain why we do these calls, what are the point of these calls, and why you should invite your friends every week. These calls are really designed to be educational. We want you to learn as much as possible, engaging. We want you to ask questions and we want to answer your questions, and really be easy opportunities for you to engage in the political process. And so we do our best to provide those opportunities. Let me know how we can improve. We are live streaming on Facebook now, and you can catch this on YouTube probably tomorrow, sometime this weekend. I usually get it up over the weekend. And it's also available on pretty much every podcast situation. Wherever you get your podcasts from, if you search RootsAction, you will find us. A couple quick updates before we get into our conversation. First off, I've mentioned this a couple times. Next week, we will have Abdul El Saeed on the call to talk about Medicare for All. And we will also have Brianna Westbrook, who was the last candidate to take on Kirsten Sinema in a Dem primary. So she's the best. She was a Justice Democrat. We're going to be talking Medicare for All, important conversation. I know several of you have reached out about Medicare for All and when we were going to be focusing on that next week. The following week, we're going to be talking about the Western Pacific, North Korea, South Korea, China, and relations there. And we're going to have Ann Wright on, Colonel Ann Wright, who is fantastic. And I'm looking to book a couple more speakers for that as well. But very excited about that. Lastly, if you have not joined our RootsAction Community Organizers Program and you want to, please let me know. I can send you information about that. Just let us know in the chat and we'll have somebody take it down and I will reach out to you. Super cool program we're doing where we can empower you to be an activist and an organizer in your own community to reach your own representative. Really cool program. I'm really excited to get that going. And you'll be working with me one-on-one to get that program going, as well as each other. So that'll be a lot of fun. Just let us know if you would like to join that program. If you're not an official volunteer for us, go to nohoneymoon.org, sign up, invite your friends, get as many people to join you as possible on this. And now to our speaker, Andrei. I'll give you a quick introduction and then we'll hop into our conversation. Andrei Tsygankov is a Russian-born academic and author in the fields of international relations. He is currently a professor at San Francisco State University in California, where he teaches comparative Russian and international politics in the political science and international relations departments. He served as program chair of the International Studies Association, ISA, from 2006-2007, and he is a contributor to both Western and Russian academia. He's written too many books, textbooks, and journal articles to actually cite, but it is a long list of them. And we're really glad you're here. Andrei, how are you doing?
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to our discussion and to your questions and comments.
Excellent. Well, we're happy to have you, and I'm sure people will have a bunch of questions for you, which we will get to towards the end of our discussion. So I guess to start, just start at a real base level. Do you think it's possible, maybe this is too deep right off the bat, but do you think it's possible for the US and Russia to have a friendly relationship? Is that something that's on the table?
Is it on the table and whether it's possible are actually two different questions. I think it's possible, but whether it's on the table at the moment is questionable. It's possible because in the past, US and Russia have had some relatively lengthy periods of stable, sometimes even cordial relationships. Even during the Cold War, this was not impossible. Some of you might recall the periods of détente. And of course, US and Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, were allies during the World War II against Nazi Germany. And before the Soviet system, Russia and the United States also did not see each other as enemies, did not see each other as threats. They disagreed for various reasons, and they did have principally different, oftentimes, political systems, but somehow that did not prevent them from finding some common grounds, from congratulating each other on important occasions. So I think that depends on how you define your interests. That depends on how you define who you are. That depends on your national identity. And at the moment, it's probably not on the table because the two countries define each other very differently. The United States defines its interests globally. Russia does not claim to have global interests, but it does want to be able to feel comfortable within a particular territorial space. That's not new. Historically, Russia also felt that it needed to have certain influence in Eurasia in particular, where it had Orthodox Christians in the Balkans. And right now it also sees itself as a country with distinct political system, with distinct idea, with distinct interests. They are not global interests, but they are still important interests to Russia, whereas the United States defines itself in global terms. Its interests are everywhere. It wants to promote democracy everywhere globally. And the problem is that in many places across the world, including Russia, that kind of promotion of democracy is viewed as hegemony, as global hegemony, as an attempt to impose your own standards, your own power, and your own interests on others. So if you continue to define your interests in such a way, it becomes a problem.
Yeah. So talking about, I think that's a really interesting way to put it, where the United States national interests are global and Russian, or at least they're claiming Russian interests are Russian, more national. How do you think the U.S. global interests play out in Russia? What does that mean? Are you talking about, being at their bases at their border, or what does that mean in Russia?
Are you asking me how the United States is viewed in Russia? How is it perceived?
Yeah. How are the United States global interests perceived in Russia?
Well, as I said, historically, following the Cold War end, there was a period where the United States was perceived in Russia as a potential partner, even strategic partner, a country with which Russia would be able to collaborate, to cooperate on multiple issues, and to ultimately join the West, to become part of the West. And that changed, that began to change in the mid-90s, where the United States decided that expanding NATO towards Russian borders would be a good idea from security standpoint, from standpoint of promoting democracy. And because Russia was not invited to join, that was perceived by many in Russia, not by all, but by many, as a potential security threat, in part because very few years passed since the end of the Cold War. And of course, NATO was established as a military alliance against the Soviet Union. The whole purpose of NATO was to provide security against the Soviet Union, against Russia. So right now, in addition to NATO, you also had multiple other important developments, such as United States support for colored revolutions, so-called colored revolutions in the former Soviet Union. Some of you may have heard about those. Ukraine went through these, Central Asian states, in particular Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and each time they went through these changes, transformations, new political regime appeared that was less friendly towards Russia. And that too became an issue in US-Europe, US-Russia relationships, Russia-Europe relationships. And then, of course, to add to this, European Union also engaged in economic expansion program, so-called good neighborhood program, also at the expense of Russia. Russia was also not invited. So in the end, the United States is viewed not as a country that seeks to promote economic openness, political openness, and stability in the world, but a country that wants Russia essentially to comply with its own interests, with its own expectations, and with its own standards of democracy, whatever these standards might be. And right now, given all these pressures, given very difficult relationships that Russia has had with the United States over all these years, and in part, given Biden's recent statements and his very emotionally difficult relationships, for the lack of a better word, with Vladimir Putin, right now the perception is that the United States is not only challenging Russia on multiple economic, political, and military interests, but it wants regime change. It wants ultimately to undermine Russia's political system, to oust Vladimir Putin, to replace him with someone else who would be more friendly towards the United States. And that's, if you will, that's the last resort. That's the ultimate defensive ground from Russian authorities' perspective. And they must dig in, they must defend themselves. And it became, as international relations scholars would say, it became a security dilemma. Whatever you do is misconstrued and misperceived on the other side as a potentially offensive. Whatever Russia does is perceived in the United States as potentially offensive, undermining American interests, undermining American political system, stealing elections, and what have you. Whatever the United States does, even if it supports some activists, political activists in Russia, pro-Western activists, it is viewed by the Kremlin, and not only by the Kremlin, but by many other in Russia, as an effort ultimately to do regime change, to undermine Russia's political system. And that becomes a vicious circle. That becomes entirely counterproductive. And whenever US supports even those pro-democracy activists in Russia, it's not doing themselves, these people, a favor. In fact, it undermines them because it creates a situation in which they're more vulnerable, and they're not supported by many, precisely because the United States is viewed, as I said, as a security threat.
Gotcha. And using the term regime change is kind of surprising to me. Is there a real fear in Russia amongst the people that war is a possibility, like an actual war?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. There is a real palpable fear that we're very close to military collision at this point. You can ask many people in the political circles, in the so-called expert circles in Russia, in Moscow, and many of them will tell you, Ryan, that the only reason why we're not in war yet is because Russia has nuclear weapons. If Russia did not have a deterrent capacity in nuclear area in particular, but also in cyber area, then the United States would have attacked Russia already, just as it did attack Libya. So nuclear program is the protection, is the deterrent capacity that prevents Russia from sliding into military confrontation. And that's ultimately is what creates and establishes peace for now in the perception of many, many people in Russia.
And I think one of the core reasons we're having this event today on Russia is because of what Biden said recently, referring to Putin as a killer without a soul. And no matter what people think about that, can you speak to why that is a bad idea for building peace? And what does that do to the Kremlin? Does that put them more in defensive posture, I guess?
It's very hard to answer, Ryan, simply because we don't know yet what will develop from it. What we know so far is that Russian ambassador in Washington has been recalled for consultations. And certainly it's not good for the two countries' relationships not to have an ambassador inside the country.
Yeah.
We also know that he is not likely to return anytime soon. Recent statements are that we are not planning to return until we see some signs of normalization on part of the United States. That's an invitation for conversation, if you will, but that invitation is not likely to be met by the White House. Joe Biden already said that he doesn't regret making that statement. And he also said in his own fashion that he should be able, the United States should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. In other words, he expects to characterize Putin as he did, characterize Russian political system as he tends to, and still get Russia to cooperate on issues that are vitally important to him. So one negative consequences of this, as I said, is that we do not have an ambassador in the United States. The other potential consequence, and that's global, that's not just bilateral relationships, US-Russia relationships, is that Joe Biden already invited Putin and China's leader, as some of you know, to the climate summit that will take place at the end of this month. I think it's scheduled for April the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken. He invited both of them more than a week ago. I think it must be 2 weeks ago. Neither one of them accepted yet. And chances are that Putin will not accept. He will not have a conversation with Joe Biden until something changes. So these two changes are already happening. Neither one of them is good news. Neither one of them is inviting future cooperation in the two countries. But it's just the beginning. We may see more of this negative news coming because the relationships already are securitized. Securitized meaning that both countries see each other's relationships, each other's potential economic, political discussions through the security lens as potentially undermining their national security. That's true for Russia, and that's true for the United States. And you know what it does to domestic systems? We know this from research in international relations that typically this kind of external threat undermines domestic political institutions, particularly domestic democratic institutions. It securitizes domestic environment as well. So in Russia, what you see as a result of these developments, and this is something that has been taking place for now for perhaps a decade or so, security elites, those with security service background, are increasingly influential in Russia, are increasingly shaping, framing, and defining politics and political system. Some of it is happening in the United States as well. Some of you know that there is a research on the so-called national security state in the United States. This is a product of military industrial complex. This is a product of foreign threats and so forth. So we are yet to see these developments. We are yet to see further securitization in response to heightening of external threats, in response to this kind of pressures coming from Joe Biden, because he certainly meant to send a message to Vladimir Putin that the United States will continue to exert powerful pressures on him, on Russia's political system, and Putin must be prepared that these pressures will only continue to rise.
Got it. Do you think, I guess this is like a complicated one, but it's a simple question. Why do you think Biden is doing this? Why do you think the tough talk coming from Biden is his strategy? Do you think it's simply because he thinks he has the power to do that dual path where he can both be tough and he just assumes that everyone will bow to the US? Or is there something else at play there?
Well, I can only guess. My guess here probably as good as yours, Ryan. Biden is is a particular personality too.
Yeah.
He likes power. He likes to be in the position of showing that power. He has demonstrated this before.
Yeah.
He does not have very good chemistry with Vladimir Putin. This goes back to Barack Obama's years. He meddled in Russian politics on several occasions. Back in the year 2011, he traveled to Russia to warn Putin not to run again for president. He said to him that the United States expects you not to run for president. And he also said to him at the time that, and you might recall this exchange between George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin, where Bush said that he saw Putin's soul.
Yeah,
So Biden played on that expression and said, well, I look at you and I don't see any soul in you at all. To which Putin replied, we understand each other. And they continued the conversation. So this mutual animosity, you might say, emotional animosity, goes back quite a while. And Biden, again, being the person that he is, probably had some pleasure at making that statements about Vladimir Putin. I do this because I can. There is nothing you can do to me. And in the meantime, I'm sending important messages to several audiences simultaneously. One of them is international. And that audience, not only Putin himself, he simply wants to intimidate Putin and to show to him that the United States has more power and that it expects Putin to comply with certain rules and regulations. But it also is a message for the United States allies in Europe, in Eastern Europe in particular, in Ukraine and elsewhere, where Biden is expected to stay very tough against Putin because it emboldens these elites. It helps these elites in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine in particular, to feel that they can stand up to Russia because they feel they can have support of the big brother, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And let's not forget that the United States itself now is in a highly polarized political situation, right, where Biden has his own audience, very important audience, the audience that may be defined as liberal elites. These elites have very particular view of Russia, a very particular view of Vladimir Putin, and so it plays very well with them as well. Biden is simply saying what is expected of him by this audience, and many of them are happy that Biden essentially makes this statement because they believe it's true. Putin is responsible for killing some domestic opponents, and therefore he should be called for it.
Right. You mentioned, Biden meddling in Russian elections in 2011. Do claims that Russia, quote unquote, stole the election in 2016, which so much of that was proven, not to be true. But how does that affect the relationship? Because the Democrats here still lean into that pretty heavily.
Absolutely.
Did that damage the relationship severely?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. And to the extent that Russia was involved, it certainly exacerbated the issue, exacerbated the problem. I would make a very important distinction here, though, between attacking the United States or stealing elections, as you put it, from the mainstream media, and influencing and meddling. Right. These are not the same things. Espionage and cyber attacks should not be confused. Many nations across the world, if they have capabilities, beginning with the United States, are engaged in espionage, are engaged in collecting, gathering all kinds of information. And the recent example we have is the so-called solar wind hack, which is also frequently attributed to Russia, although the intelligence services, American intelligence services, are simply saying it's likely that it came from Russia, but then they cannot be definitive. It's notoriously difficult to trace the origins of this. So to the extent that it happened, this was an espionage operation. This was not cyber attack. So collecting information, gathering information, and attacking particularly sensitive cyber infrastructure, two very different things. And attacking or stealing elections is also a very, very strong charge. Very limited evidence available that anything of this nature happened. So I certainly don't believe that such evidence are available at this point. What we know so far is that Russia certainly used social networks to influence American elections, to influence these elections on Donald Trump's side in his favor and against Hillary Clinton in 2016. That probably is as much as known definitively. Other evidence, including the so-called Democratic Convention site hack, are not really entirely convincing on multiple grounds. We only have one essential source for this evidence, and that's not sufficient. They are not corroborated. So I would say it's damaging, potentially quite damaging. But as I said, the other problem, the other side of the problem is that American perception of Russia, particularly perception by the political class, by liberal elites, has been securitized. Whatever Russia does is misconstrued as offensive. Even if it's espionage, even if it's intelligence gathering, it's presented as the ultimate attack. So you have all kinds of really crazy metaphors floating around, that what Russia did in 2016 is an equivalent of September the 11th. What Russia did in the 2016s is the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. This is the metaphor that Dick Cheney used. So this is essentially war. We are under attack. This is World War III. And we have already lost that war because Putin placed someone as his proxy in the White House. That's the level of absurdity that we are now bordering. That's the level of paranoia. And that's what I mean by securitization. And unfortunately, Biden shares these perceptions and these fears.
Yeah, no, I think you nail it right on the head with the essentially taking the idea of stealing an election and doing some social media meddling and combining them, conflating them like the media has done, has been damaging, especially to peace activists in the United States who are trying to build peace with Russia, like we're going to be doing tonight. And you know, earlier you mentioned an interesting point about how you believe that Russia's possession of nuclear weapons is what has prevented a war so far. And there's so many people here who are trying to get everybody to disarm, to get rid of nukes completely. And when Biden continues using language like this, it makes it just harder and harder for a country like Russia to ever think to give up those nuclear weapons. I want to get to my last question because we have a whole bunch of questions for the Q&A. I essentially, can we get to the point where the United States and Russia are lessening and getting rid of their nukes? And I guess, how can it be beneficial to the US and Russia for them to have a diplomatic, peaceful relationship?
Well, we should, we have been quite critical of Biden today, and rightfully so, but we should also give him credit for moving very fast immediately after he was elected to restart the START Treaty, to renew the START Treaty for another 5 years.
Yeah.
That's something that Trump opposed. That's something that Biden did quickly, and Putin reciprocated. This passed Russian parliament within days. It was ratified. Now, of course, we have not that much time, 5 years, for new strategic negotiations for future strategic treaty. It's not a whole lot of time because you have to engage all kinds of questions not only on ICBMs, but also on intermediate nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear missiles. You have to engage with new types of weapon systems that are being developed as we speak, hypersonic weapons, precision strikes weapons, and so forth and so on. And on top of this, you must somehow engage with countries that are already nuclear powers outside the United States and Russia, China in particular, and that will be challenge number one. How do you engage China? How do you invite them to negotiations table when they say that we don't have nearly enough of what you guys have in terms of nuclear stockpiles, so we're not ready to negotiate until you decide to go down to our level, which is a major change. So I think 5 years will run quickly. And with this climate, with this political environment, it's very difficult to expect progress. But ultimately, that's the only path. You mentioned diplomacy. Diplomacy is not only necessary, it's the only possible way of moving forward. Diplomacy, nuclear diplomacy, cyber diplomacy, rather than imposing new sanctions, bilateral sanctions, mutual sanctions, it's essential to also to have some agreement on cyber capabilities, on how to develop rules for using your cyber capabilities. What should be non-interference rules? Where are some of the red lines? The Russians have been proposing this for quite some time, by the way, but in the eyes of the current White House, they're simply not credible, and that creates another potential problem.
Right, and that's just another one of the issues that stems from the 2016 election, stolen election meddling claims. Yeah,
exactly.
I hear you. Second part of that question I want to get back to, I guess, if we picture the world, who knows how long from now, and Russia and the United States have found peace, we've gotten rid of nukes. How does that benefit the US and Russia? What are the big benefits to both countries for actually stopping these kind of hostile relationship?
Well, the benefits are obvious. You have the less weapons in the world you have, the more peaceful your relationships will be, just by definition.
Right.
And we have extremely deadly types of weapons now that have been developed by both sides. We have preparations for deploying weapons in the outer space. And that, by the way, is yet another area where militarization is about to happen. Of course, it's extremely dangerous. We will be extremely vulnerable, not only on Earth, but from the outer space as well. So if you're able to move in this direction somehow, it has to be a mutually recognized process. It has to involve all nuclear powers. You simply cannot expect others to disarm when you yourself are armed to your teeth. You have to recognize that all these changes must be gradual, and they must be reciprocal. As I said, China will simply not agree even to negotiate, even to participate in this, until the United States and Russia will be able to go to the entirely different level from where they are today. And when they are, simply by moving in this direction, simply by engaging in this diplomacy, they will be developing political relationships as well. They will be developing what's missing today, the trust that is necessary. They will be using this trust, capitalizing on this for all kinds of different relationships in security area, and political area, and economic area. There will be more cultural exchanges. So the benefits, I cannot simply list how many potential benefits we will see. It's just that I don't see the path right now moving in this direction. But the goal, of course, is fundamentally important and noble.
Yeah, and that's something we push for at RootsAction all the time. You mentioned ICBMs. That's one of RootsAction's current challenges or fights that we're a part of right now is we have the ICBMs of the future. I think it's the GBSD global, I forget, a ground-based strategic defense. And then we have a sea-based one, and it's billions and billions of dollars. And to me, peace with Russia might very well mean Medicare for all or universal health care in the United States, because that's the amount of money we're spending on defense. Lots of money. And I'm sure Russia is too, spending a ton of money on defense.
Absolutely.
We take the cake there. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said that you're right. Russia too is militarizing. It's doing this differently than the Soviet Union was doing this, because it's learned a lesson that if it's not selective in militarizing, if it's not developing the type of weapons that are necessary for protecting your sovereignty and security, if you're trying to match the United States in its military defense expenditures, then most likely you will be bankrupt before you see this, which is what happened with the Soviet Union, because they were spending 15 to 20% of their GDP for military needs. And of course, you cannot have strategic parity with the economy that is 5 to 10 times more than your economy. So what Russia is doing right now, it spends roughly 2% plus or minus of its budget for military needs, and it only develops the type of weapons that are necessary for defense purposes. It is not aiming to defeat the United States in any ways. It is aiming simply to demonstrate that it can defend itself. So it's asymmetrical military strategy rather than symmetrical.
Yeah, and I just want to point out a couple of people in our chat. Our chat is going wild right now. They're having fun. Want to point out, Karen makes a good point. In the US, we say we have a defense department, but it's not very defensive most of the time. It's an offense. It's a war department. So that's a good point. But we're going to go into the Q&A now. Thank you for answering a lot of my questions. I think there's a bunch from people, though. Some of them you've already answered. So if I don't answer your question, it's because I think we already answered it, but just type it again if you think we haven't. But let me go through some of these. Let's see. Sorry, there's a lot of them. Once Russia, USSR put itself out there as not communist anymore, the US became a fierce rival to Russia then after that. Would you say, how did the relationship change once they went from the Soviet Union to Russia?
I don't think that this is what happened immediately after the end of the Cold War. I mean, this is demonstrably different. If you recall what happened, and Gorbachev was very excited that the Cold War ended. Then the next leader after Gorbachev was Boris Yeltsin, who thought, even though they personally did not like each other, that Yeltsin was in many respects even more pro-Western than Gorbachev, and he sought to capitalize on the new opportunity. He wanted to become partner with the United States. But the new Russia went through fundamentally important domestic crisis, which sometimes in Russia is called the time of troubles. The reference is to the economic transformation that Russia went through. I don't know if it can be called transformation. In some respects, it can be, because the system changed from communist to capitalist system. But in other respects, this was really a disaster rather than transformation, because Russia lost half of its economy, 50% of its GDP, and entirely different system emerged, which was really the result of the not just robber baron stage that you guys are familiar with in the United States, but this was probably a highly even more intense criminal type of capitalism that emerged as a result of this. The economy was privatized quickly enough, and the capitalism that emerged in Russia continues to have fundamental problems. It's not widely accepted by the Russian society because many social programs disappeared, because poverty continues to be an issue in Russia, because the state oftentimes favors the new riches and security services. So that system was not quite compatible in the eyes of many in the West with the West. And the West was fearful of the Soviet Union. Now it was fearful of the new Russia. It did not want to invite Russia in its midst. It expanded NATO further. It expanded its capitalism towards Russian borders, and it supported potential political changes around Russia as well. And that ultimately changed relationships from relatively rosy, promising relationships to potentially difficult. And ultimately, when the United States joined NATO and European allies to attack Yugoslavia, some of you might recall this in 1999, many in Russia decided that they would have been next if it wasn't for nuclear weapons, because their own historical ally Serbia was attacked, and they were not consulted, of course, again in this case. So from that point forward, if you add to this American foreign policy interventions, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere, it became a conviction, as I said, for many in Russia, that the United States is, after regime change in Russia. Vladimir Putin tried also to improve relationships with the United States under George W. Bush. You might recall again, after September the 11th, the relationships have improved for several years. But Putin did not expect the United States to go to Iraq for fighting terrorism. That changed his calculus, and he moved in opposition to the United States foreign policy.
Makes sense. Thank you. David wants to know, what are your thoughts on the persecution of Pussy Riot, the band that we know that was arrested, they were jailed, the perception amongst the people versus amongst the government in Russia?
Well, yeah, I am glad that you asked that question. I thought that you would also ask me about Alexei Navalny. That's a more recent domestic development in Russia.
You can talk about him as well.
When it comes to political changes inside Russia. And I would say that both of them were perceived comparably, because when Pussy Riot occurred, that, if I'm not mistaken, is 2011. This is when the Kremlin decided ultimately to prosecute these three young women who were in the main cathedral, dancing in the main cathedral on the altar, and they were ultimately, two of them were ultimately jailed. This was supported roughly by 60% of the population. By about 60% of the population felt that this was well deserved by them for not being respectful, not so much for Putin, but for the main cathedral, for the church, for insulting the feelings of believers in Russia. And I would say this is about the same, a little bit less, the same amount of people who are now supporting the jailing of Alexei Navalny. It's about 50%, about half of the population feel that Navalny was jailed correctly, and about 30%, it also depends on the age. The younger generation feels stronger in favor of Navalny. The older generation is more siding more with the Kremlin. So I'd say today it's 50-30 percentage-wise. 50 in favor, still supportive of the Kremlin's actions against Navalny, and about 30 arguing that he was not jailed fairly, justifiably, he should be freed. That's
Those,
the perception, if that's what you're asking me about.
yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And I think the split along age lines is common everywhere,
Right.
with situations like this. So that makes sense. Um, Ed wants to know, how can American activists support Russians who want things like liberty, who oppose Putin, pro-democracy? How can we support those people without supporting American imperialism? Is there a route? Is there anything we can do to help, or should we, like you said earlier, just stay out because we make things worse?
I think certainly that's what I would say with respect to the officials, with respect to American officials. Oftentimes, their attempts to improve things, even if it's genuine, even if it's not driven by ulterior motives, is often counterproductive, often makes things worse because of the securitized perception. This help for domestic political activists in Russia coming from Biden is viewed essentially as a help for the fifth column in Russia, for those people who are eager to get rid of Putin. And that's, by the way, how Alexei Navalny is frequently viewed in Russia, simply because he is someone who is more known for calling Vladimir Putin criminal, thief, and corrupt politician, but someone who doesn't have a grassroots program or a grassroots campaign for what exactly he's trying to accomplish, what is his vision of a future Russia. That is often missing. So he is viewed as someone who is the power agent, and therefore, whenever he is supported by Western governments as someone who is pro-democracy and pro the West, that is viewed as hypocritical. So I'd say the government, the best it can do is to address this issue privately with Russian leaders, not use microphone, so to speak, but try to address this issue, to raise concerns individually in their political conversations with Russian politicians. And I would say the strongest message that America can send to the outside world, to Russia in particular, is to get your own house in order, is to build democracy at home, because that image of American democracy is awfully undermined in the world today. Yeah. Very few people now in Russia believe that America is a democracy. Very few people believe that America can, in fact, claim democracy standards, let alone promote democracy. Mm-hmm. So my view here is that the best message is ultimately the power of example. That message resonates. That message works much better than attempts to believe that everyone must change as we wish based on our standards, whatever these standards might be.
So the best advice for American citizens for citizen diplomacy is essentially to go to work in our own country?
Absolutely, to begin and complete very important reforms that have been long overdue in America, not just 1 decade, but perhaps since the end of the World War II, to dismantle to the extent possible the military-industrial complex, to make sure that the economy is primarily civilian-oriented, that has best possible facilities, infrastructure, best opportunities for small business, middle-sized business, for teachers, for middle class. That would be best contribution you can possibly have to the world of democracy.
That's a really interesting answer. Thank you for that. All right, just one last question, and then we'll move on to our action. Peter wants to know, can you tell us about the U.S. involvement in the Ukrainian election in 2014 and how that may affect today's relationship between the U.S. and Russia? How does that play into our relationship?
That's a great question, and I don't know if I can answer it quickly, because 2014 is in many ways the defining moment of the global power transition that we are now entering. It's not just China that is rising, and challenging the United States, but very much Russia in response to the perceived meddling in Ukrainian affairs. At the time, I'm trying to formulate it in a relatively succinct manner. There was a coup d'etat in Ukrainian politics, and let me put it in a somewhat simplified form. The pro-Kremlin candidate lost, and the pro-Western candidate, or several candidates, won the power struggle. And the United States, instead of insisting on continuing negotiations and power brokerage, simply supported their own guy in this case, Pyotr Poroshenko. And that left for the Kremlin, for Putin to conclude that the United States not only supported, but in fact prepared ahead of time for that coup d'etat, and ultimately grabbed Ukraine as a strategic site against Russia, which is why it provides lethal weapons for Ukrainian army right now, which is why it provides all kinds of political and economic support for Ukraine, and which is why it blames Russia only for the Russia-Ukrainian crisis that is ongoing today. So that's why at the time, Ukraine became a hostage of this power struggle between Russia and the United States. And that's why that particular incident and Barack Obama's involvement in it, to the extent that he was involved, also greatly poisoned relationships.
Yeah, and it frames up 2016 a lot, pretty clearly. Right after, we basically did the same thing in a lot of ways. Maybe different tactics, different strategies, but going to similar ends. Well, is there anything you want to leave us on before we go to our action? Is there any final closing thoughts you have?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for all your questions and comments.
Yeah, well, thank you, Andrei. Really appreciate having you. Maybe we'll have you on again if there's some updates in the U.S.-Russia relationship. Hopefully, we can do some work and urge some diplomacy from our own. But with that, thank you very much.
Sure.
Feel free to log off now, and I really appreciate you joining us.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Have a good night. All right. That was a great conversation. If you didn't get your question answered, I tried to get through them all. The chat was busy tonight. So send me your questions if we didn't get them answered, and I will send them to Andrei, and we will get them answered to the best of our ability. Yeah, I appreciate all the engagement tonight. It's been fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Make sure. And we are going to go ahead and start our action. I posted it really